Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Darcy, Administrator Persiepe. I have a couple questions. Number one, the administration has committed to streamlining and expediting permitting for major infrastructure projects that move energy. However, it seems that the EPA waters of the U.S. rule will do just the opposite because it creates new subcategories of water that could be subject to federal jurisdiction. Is there any way for the EPA, Mr. Administrator, to guarantee that this rule will not further delay permitting for energy infrastructure projects?
Sorry. Our view is that we're not expanding the jurisdiction, and we're actually excluding some things that may be involved with some energy development projects. I mean, I don't see how this will add to the burden.
Okay. I'm going to get to a few more questions that I think may get back to this. We're a little frustrated by what could be the regional approach to some of the permitting issues, and I'm going to give you a couple examples in just a second. But you also mentioned, Mr. Administrator, that in your testimony, the EPA and the Corps then worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to ensure that concerns raised by farmers in the ag industry were addressed in the proposed rule. Did you also consult with the EPA Science Advisory Board, which now includes, due to the Farm Bill and amendment that I introduced, agriculture interests?
Science Advisory Board,
yeah.
Did you say? Yeah, the Science Advisory Board will be looking at this proposed rule before it goes final, but they haven't completed their review, and we haven't set. They're currently reviewing some of the science documents that go along with this as well. And one of the reasons, in addition to stakeholder requests, that we've extended the time period for public comment is we wanted to complete the Science Advisory Board's review of some of the science documents so that that review is out there at the same time as the rulemaking docket is still open. All
right. Another quick question on the energy side that I forgot to ask. Secretary Darcy, can you give me any idea how other agencies and industries, subjectively determine what might actually be covered by a Clean Water Act permit?
Under the proposed rule? I mean, how would they comment?
Under the proposed rule.
Under the proposed rule, anyone who believes that they would be impacted by the proposed rule can comment to us.
So through the comment process, they can come in because they might believe that they could be impacted, could be required to maybe self-report, work with their regional offices, et cetera, on an energy infrastructure project?
Yes, because then they would want to know if they would be subject to the rule, so yes.
All right, in your proposed rule, it mentions that waste treatment systems are not included in the definition of the proposed rule of the Clean Water Act of waterways, right?
Yes.
Okay, does that change the EPA's jurisdiction over above-ground septic discharge systems that many in my district actually have to utilize because of either soil type issues or rural living arrangements?
I turned it off when I thought I was turning it on. I don't believe EPA does not regulate septic tanks.
You may want to check with your regional office that covers my state of Illinois, because above-ground septic discharge systems are being regulated by that regional office under an NPDES permit. And that's part of my frustration of maybe what you see and what you hear in Washington isn't getting to your regional offices, because members of ag interests in the state of Illinois met with the U.S. EPA just very recently. It may have been yesterday or this morning, on what are the requirements for above-ground septic discharge permits. And it said that it is the EPA, your region said, is the responsibility of the potential discharger to determine whether or not his or her system might discharge into a water of the United States. And it said, even during this self-determination, this comes from the EPA's guidance. Frequently asked questions on EPA's NPDES general permit for new and replacement surface discharging systems in Illinois, an FAQ sheet. I'll go right to the point. It says, if so, even though pollutants would not be carried to waters of the United States unless your area experienced an exceptionally wet season, you are still required to obtain coverage under a permit. Only if you are sure that your system would not discharge pollutants to a water of the United States or a conveyance that leads to a water of the United States should you forego obtaining a permit for surface discharging system. If you do not obtain a permit but actually discharge, you may be subject to an enforcement action under the Clean Water Act. This gets to the point of the rule, sir. It specifically says wastewater discharge systems will not be subject to the proposed rule and the change. But your regional office is basically saying self-report. However, we may fine you if you're wrong, because it may actually discharge, according to their own guidance, it may discharge into a navigable waterway. Can you see where we have some problems here when it comes to what you're talking to us about and then what goes back to the region and then has a tremendous impact on the families that I represent and that all of us represent here in this country?
Well, I'm at a loss to determine whether or not, I mean, first of all, this is a proposed rule, so the regions are probably not dealing with it now anyway, but we think the waste treatment exclusion has been in existence before this rule. We're trying not to change it, so I can't answer you here, and I'll find out for you why something like that doesn't fall under the existing waste treatment exclusion. I just don't know the answer to it.
Well, thank you, and I do appreciate your willingness to do so. And I'm going to end by saying this because I'm out of time. Many rural communities in Illinois, some of the poorest areas in Illinois, have to rely upon an above-ground septic discharge system. And it is an issue where they can't be worried about the EPA determining whether or not there's going to be an enforcement action based on this NPDES permitting process that seems to be so vague and seems to be in direct contradiction with the proposed rule. So thank you for getting back to me. Secretary Darcy, thank you for your time too, and thank you to both of you for being here today.